Greetings. My name's Jed Shlackman, and I work as a holistic counselor, a hypnotherapist, and energy healer. And for this video, I'll be talking about a particular illness that people are currently concerned about in some areas. As a disclaimer at the beginning, I want to state that this is for educational purposes. This video is not intended to replace medical diagnosis or treatment for any health concerns that you may have. And now on to the topic at hand. We'll be speaking about measles. Measles is an illness that commonly appears in childhood, and it's an illness that for a number of decades health officials have had vaccine campaigns for. So a majority of the population in most areas have received those shots that are intended to prevent a natural infection or a natural symptomatic infection of the measles illness from occurring. Now in this video I want to look at the topic of that illness from a holistic medicine, from a metaphysical, mind-body, energetic perspective, looking deeper at what creates a particular illness, what could lead someone to quote-unquote catch or not catch the symptoms of that illness, how we could holistically prevent and treat or respond to the appearance of that illness. So to explain this perspective, I'll first discuss the conventional mainstream modern medicine perspective, which looks at this type of illness as purely an infectious disease, a situation where a person comes in contact with a specific microorganism, and in that theoretical viewpoint, that organism starts to spread in their body and create the symptoms that are given the medical label of that particular illness. So there are some assumptions or presumptions that are present there. So in that viewpoint, if the person shows a certain set of symptoms and you run some type of biological test that identifies the presence of that particular microbe, in this case a virus that is called a measles virus, then it's presumed that exposure to that particular virus, which it's presumed the person received from some external source, even though there's no way to prove that that's the case, to prove that the person didn't generate that virus within their own body. So there's that presumption there that that particular microbe is the reason these particular symptoms are appearing. And there's also the presumption that if you were to provide some type of treatment that kills or neutralizes that microorganism, then the symptoms of that illness will go away. And also that if you could provide some type of a vaccine prior to a person being exposed to that microorganism naturally, so creating a form of artificial exposure to some representation of that microbe, that you can prepare the body to more rapidly respond to some future natural exposure, so that they'll have theoretically a much more mild reaction. They won't have a full-blown set of symptoms from that exposure. Now, if you assume that that theory is accurate, there's a question of whether doing that using the vaccination is beneficial or not in a broader general health sense or long-term sense. Is there any trade-off in trying to create a more rapid reaction to that exposure? Could it potentially lead to any unintended consequence or some form of collateral damage in some way to the immune system or any other aspect of the body? So these are actually complex questions to set up experimental methodologies to explore or assess, and it's hard to find really well formulated in-depth research to look into some of these questions, although there are people that are trying to put different pieces of the puzzle together by integrating many different areas of research that are relevant to those questions. But for now, we're going to leave that part of the discussion aside. We have this mainstream medicine ideology of how infections occur, of how an illness appears in conjunction with or correlation with the appearance of particular microorganisms. And it's kind of interesting that they're not providing an explanation of why a particular microorganism will create only a certain effect in the body or will only appear to proliferate in certain tissues or certain organs. So why is it generally a very limited activation of that particular organism in the body? That's another question that could be explored. So from the metaphysical or mind-body medicine perspective, any condition that arises within our body will typically have some type of psychological or emotional correlate or causal trigger for it. It's actually the body functioning as a mirror in a way for consciousness. It's metaphorically or symbolically expressing some type of pattern that's occurring in our mental and emotional functioning. So we're going to look at a couple of the more well-known theoretical perspectives in relation to metaphysical medicine or the mind-body roots of particular illnesses. The first source I'm going to refer to is Dr. Michael J. Lincoln. He was a psychologist as well as a student of spiritual traditions, and he and his colleagues collected many thousands of case studies looking at a very wide range of illnesses, diseases, symptoms, and the psychological and social patterns that connected with them, looking at things such as childhood experiences, familial dynamics, so seeing how those patterns led to conditions or symptoms physically occurring that in some way expressed or reflected what was happening in the psyche. So this is one of his books, Messages from the Body, Their Psychological Meaning. And for the topic of measles, I'm going to read what Dr. Lincoln expressed as the mind-body, the psychological meaning of that particular condition or set of symptoms. So he lists here measles as an infectious viral disease, and he states in quotation marks, "They're after me," they feel unsafe, betrayed, rejected, and attacked. They have concluded that they can't be themselves, and they are in grief about that. It is the outcome of a self-immersed family system who reacted to them on a convenience concern basis. So that's his explanation of what's happening psychologically or emotionally with someone who's diagnosed with the measles illness. Now, the measles illness is an illness that tends to appear primarily in childhood. It's much less common in adults. That was the case even in the past, many decades ago, centuries ago. So even before mass vaccination was introduced around the mid to late 20th century, measles was appearing mostly in younger children, much less frequently in those who are older. So it's interesting to consider if viruses or bacteria or other microorganisms are the cause of illness, then why would people of certain age ranges and not of other age ranges be likely to manifest that illness? Also, why would some geographical areas be more likely to manifest it than others? So looking at some of those demographic factors and what might be an explanation for that is something we could consider. To go further into this, I'm going to explore some information shared by those who are followers of what's called German New Medicine. And this was a philosophy of what causes illness developed by a physician in Germany named Dr. Hamer. And there have been other healing practitioners or physicians who have developed comparable or related systems to this new medicine. You'll see things such as biodecoding or biogenealogy, where they have a very similar explanation for how psychological stresses and conflicts trigger different physical conditions. So let's explore what the new medicine approach has to say about measles. Measles is a set of symptoms that appear on the skin, so it's under the category of skin conditions. And in the new medicine system, they look at skin conditions as occurring in a couple of different layers of the skin. There's an outer and inner layer, and one of those layers represents psychological conflicts related to attack, and the other layer to psychological conflicts related to separation. So interestingly, in this model, measles is seen as related to the separation conflicts. In this article from the Learning German New Medicine website, learninggnm.com, it states, in measles, rubella, also known as German measles, and chickenpox, the skin rash covers most of the body. Generalized separation conflicts, which affect the entire body, are typically experienced by infants and young children who are much more vulnerable regarding separations from the pack at home, at school. So separation from your social group at home and or your social group at school. How the childhood disease presents itself depends on which epidermal layer is involved. Chickenpox goes deeper than measles and rubella, and on the intensity of the preceding conflict active phase. Rubella causes milder symptoms than measles. With the syndrome, that is, with water retention as a result of an active abandonment conflict, the blisters of the skin rash appear more dramatic. An intense healing phase is accompanied by high fever. So, to add some context here, in German New Medicine, they look at illnesses as occurring in different phases, where it originates with some type of psycho-emotional trigger, some stress or conflict that occurs, and as a result of that, there's an impact, a shock, you could say, to the brain, to a specific correlated location in the brain, and that part of the brain biologically controls a particular area of the body, and that kind of relay system will then transmit some signal or information changing the activity in that part of the body to reflect the symptoms of that illness, depending on the phase of this process. So the initial phase puts the individual or the organism into kind of like this heightened arousal stress state. So if you think of being traumatized or shocked, you get activated, right? Like it's giving you a rush of adrenaline, it's harder to sleep. So you're in some sort of trauma reaction mode: fight, flight, freeze, please, appease, like you're trying to do something to survive or protect yourself in response to that stress or conflict. But then when things kind of settle down, then your body has probably built up some toxicity, and you need to start going through a cleansing process to release the overload of stress hormones, the buildup of whatever toxins might have accumulated in your body while you are in that stress state and not able to keep up with the natural detoxification or rest phase in life. So if you're not sleeping, your body isn't clearing toxins out in its normal cycle that it would otherwise be doing, so they start to build up. And they're going to build up until you're able to go into that relaxation recovery phase. And then at that point, the detox process might appear, which is actually when the more visible symptoms of an illness might appear. So this is the way German New Medicine looks at it, where the kind of visible dramatic symptoms of illness tend to appear in that phase where you're actually recovering, or you're going through more of the healing phase of that trauma. You're no longer in the reaction, fight, flight kind of mode, or that situation. You're actually starting to come back toward your homeostasis or balance. But as part of that, you need to clear out or break down something that accumulated. It could be toxicity, it could be some type of tumor growth that started to develop. Your body's now ready to break those things down and clear them out. And the microbes that appear in that phase are actually seen as symbiotic. Your body is allowing them to start to activate so it can use them to clear out biological waste. Now, there are situations where that process could kind of become too extreme or kind of out of control, where you might need to intervene to slow down or stop that overload of bacteria or viruses or whatever is there breaking stuff down for the detoxification. The person might be too weak to fully handle that at a particular time and you might need to slow it down. But in general, in that theoretical model, they encourage people to not interfere with the detoxification, but to actually provide support so the person can rest and recover and go through that in a successful way where they actually completely clear out and resolve the biological remnants or residues of the trauma or conflict. Now, if you think of what a fever is, a fever can serve a purpose of actually stopping the replication of viruses. So if you have a viral type of infection, quote-unquote infection, depending on your perspective, but if you have viruses that are active in your body, whether you see them as attacking you or helping you heal, there could be a point where your body needs to stop them from continuing to replicate so it can conclude that phase or process of the illness, and a fever can serve that purpose since the elevated temperature interferes with the ability of viruses to use the genetic machinery of your own cells to replicate themselves. Basically, viruses are not like other living organisms. They don't reproduce themselves. They need to use the cellular machinery, we could say, of a host organism to replicate themselves. So they're using your cells or the cells of some other animal to replicate their own genetic material. And on their surface, they may use a certain protein coating that comes from the host. So that's why they'll say that a virus is let's say, a cow influenza or chicken influenza or human influenza, because the coating, the material that it's taken from a host, is from that particular animal. But it could actually move from one type of animal to another, and then it becomes labeled a virus associated with that new type of animal that it's in. So anyway, to add to the information from the German New Medicine website, it says, based on the understanding of the fourth biological law from that healing model, these childhood diseases are not contagious viral infections as claimed, but are the healing phase of separation conflicts experienced by more children at the same time. Such collective separation conflicts can be school-related, a separation associated with a schoolmate or teacher, or home-related, affecting all siblings. In young children, measles occurs typically in the fall, after the child has become familiar with the teacher and is accustomed to being picked up by mom daily after school. The skin rash is the visible sign that the separation conflict has been resolved. If the pediatrician knows that the child is not vaccinated, a measles diagnosis is much more likely. Not being allowed or not wanting to have contact with someone who has the quote infection results in a quote spreading of separation conflicts rather than of the condition itself. Measles outbreaks in school or among a larger population are often linked to the fear of coming in contact with an infected person. So their model focuses on the psychological aspect, and that being the true source of these symptoms manifesting. They don't put the blame on the virus or the microorganism, even though some people who promote this theory or explanation do accept that those particular organisms are there. They are playing a role in what's happening in the body and generating those symptoms, but the fundamental cause is not an external microbial organism. It's actually the psychological or emotional stress. And then the body, in its process of resolving that stress or conflict, is using the microorganisms that naturally exist and are around us all the time in our environment to generate those symptoms of cleansing, in a sense. So I'm presenting that model for you to contemplate, to consider how it relates to what's actually manifesting in our reality in people's lives when they are displaying symptoms of illness. If you consider that stress is actually the underlying trigger for the vast majority of physical health symptoms, then we could look at what types of stresses exist. And there are, of course, emotional and psychological stresses, while there are also biological stresses. So biological stresses include various chemicals that exist in our environment that overload our body that we're not meant to be using as nourishment, but which are only creating some type of stress or strain on the body's ability to maintain its own integrity. When different foreign chemicals are in our surroundings and we come into contact with them either through breathing, through physical touch or contact, or through ingesting or drinking something, our body has to process that and to expel any aspect of that that it can't use for its benefit. So we're naturally doing that all the time, but sometimes we're exposed to some intense or extreme amount of harmful chemicals, and if that's happening chronically for a sustained period of time, similar to the idea of chronic psychological stress, a stress that's continuing where we have to be overly focused on reacting to that stress and we don't have a chance to relax, then it tends to lead to some form of illness or disease. And that happens with both the psychological and the biological stresses or toxicities, and often those come in combination with one another. So it's like the psychological on top of the biological, and the person just gets overloaded and their body tries to use microbes to assist its ability to handle those toxicities. So if you think about what different microorganisms do, a lot of them function in nature to break down or in some way process different elements or toxins or dead organic matter. So if you look at what happens when anything in nature is starting to get weak or dying or already dead, you see different microorganisms starting to break down those cells, those tissues of that organism. It's a recycling process that exists throughout the natural world. It's there for a purpose and it affects every living thing. We're all part of an ecosystem that needs to constantly regenerate. So if we're not in a state of health, of vitality, of our energy flowing smoothly, then our body could start to break down in various areas, and then those microbes, whether you're focused on viruses or bacteria or fungus or parasites. Those are all organisms that in some way help recycle dead or dying biological material. So if we see them starting to proliferate in our body, we want to look for what's the root cause of that occurring. Just trying to kill off those organisms may provide a temporary respite. It may temporarily clear away symptoms of illness, but if the underlying stresses haven't been resolved, then those illnesses are likely to come back or return later, or even a more serious or deep form of illness might arise. So if you experience something like a cold or flu or measles or chickenpox, and your body goes through that fully and uses it to cleanse itself and resolve some form of stress, then that could actually reduce your vulnerability to illnesses of the same type or more serious illnesses such as cancer that could occur in the future. And there are some people that have done research looking at those correlations, seeing where having had some of those childhood illnesses appears to reduce the likelihood of having some other types of illnesses later on. So that's why I mentioned earlier that trying to prevent having symptomatic cases of those particular illnesses may seem like a positive thing if you just look on the surface, short term or superficially, but if you take a broader, more holistic view, you might see things differently and might think twice about trying to use vaccination or some other approach to keep your body from ever displaying symptoms of those processes. I know that this is some complex information to process. It's a radically different way of looking at what are termed infectious diseases than most doctors in the mainstream medical system have presented. But from a metaphysical medicine and mind-body medicine perspective, and looking at my own experiences and experiences of all the people I've interacted with, I see the holistic view of things as actually more complete and more accurate than the traditional germ theory that looks at things in a more surface level, linear way, just taking a snapshot of what's appearing in the body at a particular moment, just saying, okay, you're displaying these particular symptoms of illness and you have this particular microorganism showing up in your body, so we conclude this organism causes this illness. But looking more in depth, it's not that simple. It's actually more multifaceted or multi-layered. There are other variables, we'll say, that actually preceded both the proliferation of that microorganism and the symptoms of illness that appeared in your body. So we can look at those preceding factors, at the biological terrain, at the psychological stresses, and we can kind of watch this full, in a sense, four-dimensional or five-dimensional holographic animation that's playing out, where you're not just taking a snapshot photo of seeing that there's a rash on your body and seeing under the microscope that you have a certain virus or bacteria there, but actually seeing everything that's been occurring leading up to that and seeing kind of in live action what's occurring in the present moment and continuing forward. So if we could see that whole sequence everything that's unfolding, we would have a different understanding of the process of disease forming, of being healthy versus being ill. We would have a more complete awareness of what's happening and of how we could respond to that situation to support healing and support our ongoing ability to maintain our health and well-being. So what keeps our body in balance, what keeps our mind and our emotions more in balance as well, those are things we can explore. So you can choose whatever you wish to do in preventing or treating a particular illness. In this case, we've been discussing the measles illness, but your choices can be more thoroughly informed. You can have a more broad view or understanding of what's actually happening biologically and psychologically, and the implications of any efforts to intervene either as a prevention or treatment when those symptoms are appearing. For those that are interested in holistic health and wellness, I invite you to visit my website, phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. For now, I wish everyone a wonderful day. Namaste.